Welcome to An Author's Journey, where a prominent author chats with us about their journey as a writer. I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Our featured guest today is author Jessica Vitalis. An active fiction writer since she began writing stories as a third grader, Jessica focused on poetry when she became a sixth grader. She is proud of the fact that years later, her homeroom teacher read one of her poems at a high school commencement ceremony. She even considered writing as a profession when, during her senior year of college, Jessica was asked by Harbrace to write an essay that they would include in their college handbook. Instead of becoming a writer, Jessica took a different path for her career. She pursued a career in business, eventually earning her MBA at Columbia Business School. During her studies, she took a class called Creativity and Personal Mastery. One of her assignments was to identify her ideal career. As could be expected, a career in writing was the result. Jessica began by writing picture books, young adult novels, and contemporary middle grade stories. Her passion for writing became fully realized, however, when she began writing fantasy novels for 10 to 14-year-old readers. Her mission as a writer is, in her words, quote, to foster a love of books through entertaining stories that engage readers in a meaningful reflection, unquote. Furthermore, on her website, Jessica makes this offer to us, her readership. Quote, if you are a fan of fantasy, you've come to the right place. Together, we'll explore kingdoms, fight creatures real and imagined, and face our deepest fears. With a little luck, we'll come out the other side a little wiser and a whole lot braver for having lived through nightmares, unquote. With that offer in place, let's welcome Jessica Vitalis to take an author's journey with us today. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic introduction, and I'm really excited to be here talking middle grade books with you.
You're a terrific writer, and you deserve an introduction like that. And I wish I could have done more, but it would be all introduction at that point. And we do want a chance to chat with you.
Well, thank you very much.
So let's go with that first question. Every author has a signature style that identifies their work. What is your signature style, and do you set out to incorporate that style when you begin to write your plan for writing, or does it just sort of develop?
That's a fascinating question. When I think of my signature style, I don't think so much in terms of craft, in terms of how I write the story. I more think about the types of stories that I want to put out in the world. So for me, the signature style has more to do with what you were talking about when you mentioned my mission, and that's writing stories that are really fun for the readers, but also that make them ask really interesting questions and make them reflect about themselves and the world around them.
I like that because it doesn't seem as if your writing is taken from a formula base. It's not cookie cutter writing. And I tell you, I absolutely loved A Rabbit's Tale. That was exciting. The Rabbit's Gift, sorry. The fact that you were able to juggle two different narrators is not an easy task. And to me, the way you wrote it does not lose the reader at all. It just takes everything smoothly.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. I think that grows from the fact that I actually wrote for 13 years before I got my first book deal. So my first book, The Wolf's Curse, came out actually 15 years after I started writing. So I had written 5 or 6 manuscripts before that book sold and worked on craft for years and years and years. And it really explored different types of stories, different types of craft, different ways of telling story. And so by the time I got to this point in my career, I feel pretty confident about taking chances and trying out new things.
Now let's stay with The Rabbit's Gift for a while.
Mm-hmm.
In an interview with MG Book Village, you mentioned that The Rabbit's Gift, quote, was inspired by the French version of our stork mythology, which holds that instead of being delivered by storks, babies are grown in cabbages and delivered by fairies. In The Rabbit's Gift, babies are grown in these cabbage-like plants and delivered by the rabbits, unquote. Folks don't realize, but The Cabbage Patch Kids, that whole craze kind of came from that, didn't it?
It really did. And well, so first of all, I know you want to talk about The Rabbit's Gift, but you kind of have to go back to my first book, The Wolf's Curse, to really understand the genesis of how all of this came about. Because The Wolf's Curse was also a twist on European lore, except it's a twist on Grim Reaper mythology. And so it's narrated by a great white wolf searching for somebody to take her job. But I was really wanting to do a companion novel, and I always thought of The Wolf's Curse as my death book. And so I thought a companion novel would be nice to do something opposite. But obviously, a birth book isn't exactly appropriate for the middle grade novel. So I really was starting to lose hope, and I was complaining to a critique partner about my lot in life and how difficult this was to find a companion novel. And she asked if I was familiar with that French mythology, La Fille à Choux, which is actually a black and white silent film from 1896. And it was made by the first female French maker, Alice Guy Blanchet. And
Yes.
just 1 minute long. Did you go watch the clip? Have you seen the clip of this film?
Yes.
It's fantastic. It's this she literally, the female filmmaker literally dresses up as a fairy, and she prances around this sort of cabbage field, and she plucks babies out of them, and then she unceremoniously just drops them on the ground. And so the minute I saw that, I knew absolutely that I had my idea for my second story. I also was familiar with the Cabbage Patch mythology because I grew up in the 80s and I loved that. And I really tried to stay away from that in writing this story because I didn't want to run into any trouble with, copyright, trademark
Sure.
kind of stuff. So I really just tried to hone in on what it means to be in this world where I didn't want to have fairies deliver the baby. So that's why I turned to rabbits. It felt like a good companion for The Wolf's Curse, but that's the genesis of the whole story.
Was there a special message that you wanted to get across to your readers who were reading through the Rabbit's Gift, and maybe there was a lesson behind this, or there was something that you wanted them to consider?
Oh, I explore so many things in The Rabbit's Gift, and I try hard to stay away from overt lessons because nobody wants to be preached at. And again, I really want my readers to enjoy this process. But the kinds of questions that I hope they ask when they're reading this story have to do with their traditions and their personal beliefs and how sometimes those beliefs might or might not rub up against science. I hope they're thinking about things like power and privilege. I hope they're thinking about our very tenuous relationship with nature and our impact on the environment. And then, of course, the evergreen themes of family and friendship. So there's a lot to be mined in this story.
And I think you're very wise in doing that, because I agree that preaching at an audience will very much limit your audience, and it won't be as effective as just putting out the situations, the conditions, the parameters, and having folks kind of discover things.
Mhm.
And I like that so much about the Rabbit's Gift. Not only was there a lot of discovery there, but it was told in such a fascinating way that as I'm reading through this book, it's capturing my attention and holding it because I feel like I'm part of the action. It's written in such a conversational manner, and again, not in that preachy style, that I don't know how someone would not be pulled into a story like that and just be entertained.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. The dual point of view was really a lot of fun to write, and that sort of came out of wanting to explore, again, a companion novel. But my first book, The Wolf's Curse, was written in an omniscient point of view with the invisible great white wolf. And every time I started writing this story with my rabbit, I thought that it had to be an omniscient rabbit to be a companion. And all of my critique partners kept saying, this sounds just like The Wolf's Curse. It's not working. You have to do something different. And so finally I let that go, and I started writing from this very sweet rabbit's point of view. But at the same time, I felt like something was missing, and I didn't want to tell the whole story from the rabbit's point of view. So I thought, well, what if I just add in the second point of view and sort of play back and forth between the rabbit and the human. And the really cool thing about that was I got to do something kind of different in that I didn't have to identify a protagonist and an antagonist in my story, which is typically how we're taught to write books. Instead, I let each character think that they were the hero in their story and that the other point of view character was the villain. And that was just not only a lot of fun to write, but really cool that I got to play with the power of perspective and what really makes a villain. And can somebody make a mistake? And does that make them a villain? And can they be redeemed?
I like what you're saying because as someone who's taught writing for quite a few years, I never have felt comfortable with formulaic writing. Things have to be in the form of a 5-paragraph essay.
Mhm.
The hook has to come here and nowhere else. Everything has to be connected in this way or that way or whatever the formula says, because we know that the great writers don't do things that way. Now, granted, they are able to do them that way if they want to, but their vision takes them somewhere else. And I think what's unstated but well intended in what you do is that you connect your thoughts with your heart and with your gut. You feel things in a almost an intrinsic way, and you feel things in a heartfelt way, but you also follow the logic of things. And bringing those three aspects together, I believe, is the reason that your books are as successful as they are.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I will say that hasn't always been the case. That's been a long journey in my 13 years of writing. So plot comes very, very naturally to me. I'm a person who likes to start at the beginning and I like to just play and figure out where I'm going. And it took me a long time to realize that stories aren't about plot. Stories are actually about the character's journey and the plot carries them on that journey. But it's not until you really show the character's heart and really get into their emotions that readers fall in love with stories. So it wasn't until I learned how to do that and how to put that on the page that I think my writing career really took off.
Do you find that that's difficult for most writers, or can you just speak from your own experience?
So I mentored other writers for several years in a program called Pitch Wars that doesn't run anymore. But from what I could see, typically writers fall into two categories. You're either a plotter or you're somebody who only cares about character. And a lot of times people who are plotters have trouble with character, and a lot of people who write about character have these wild meandering plots that the reader can't really get on board with and figure out. So to me, it really is figuring out what your strength is, what your weakness is, and then figuring out how to meld those together to create a story that readers will appreciate.
Now that sounds very methodical and targeted. And I know you have a background in business. Has that contributed in any way?
I suppose it probably has. When we talk about craft, I actually am very craft focused in the sense that I spend a lot of years studying craft. I spend a lot of years studying traditional plot and traditional storytelling techniques. And I think that's really important because if you don't understand what's being published and how authors are getting there, then it's hard to make the leap to doing something different and still have it work. So you wouldn't go out. I always use the analogy that you wouldn't go out and perform open heart surgery without having practiced or gone to medical school before,
Right.
right? And you especially wouldn't do that with a new procedure, something that had just been developed. So it's like that with writing. I think people need to learn the basics so that they can figure out how they want to bring their own twist to it.
I'm going to bring up something about the Wolf's Curse that I found fascinating. I know that when people look to read a book, that the first thing they look at is the cover.
Mhm.
Cover is the main attraction. And when I looked at the front cover of the Wolf's Curse, I saw a baying wolf. The moon is in the sky, and it's strategically framed by the wolf's jaws. But as I look closer, in the wolf's face, I saw embedded more faces of the wolves. And there's a young boy sitting on the edge of the wolf's snout. So I guess my question is, how did that design all come about? And what is the intended message from that cover art? I
Yes.
think it's very clever.
Absolutely. I could just sit and stare at that book cover all day long. Unfortunately, I cannot claim any responsibility for that cover. So I don't know if your viewers know this, but authors don't actually get to choose their covers. Once they sell the manuscript to a publisher, the publisher owns that book and they decide on the cover and design. So in this case, my agent was able to write into the contract that I would be able to have some input. So my editor emailed me and said, what are you thinking of for the cover? Do you have any suggestions? And I told her, yeah, I actually don't really want a wolf on the cover because they tend to come across as too cartoonish, and that's not the right tone for the book. And we actually got on the phone and we were talking, and she was laughing and said, the name of the book is The Wolf's Curse. So we kind of have to have a wolf on the cover. So, okay, but really, I don't want a cartoonish wolf on the cover. Can we do anything? So she took that information away and she took it to the designer. And he worked up a sketch and he hired a couple of illustrators called the Balbuso sisters. And they are two Italian sisters that do the most glorious book designs. They're just incredible artists. And so I don't know what the behind the scenes process was, but they came back with two sketches. One was completely different than this. And then there was this sketch that everybody on the team just immediately agreed was perfect to set the tone for the book. So I don't know how they arrived at that process, but man, is it brilliant.
I looked at that cover and I said, even people who might not be interested in this genre would at least pick up the book to look at the cover.
That's
and
what
it might attract you.
Absolutely. He said, this is the kind of book people will buy just to put on their coffee table. And I said, well, it's not really a coffee table kind of book, but yes, the cover is beautiful. And that made me really nervous when it came time for The Rabbit's Gift, because I just thought, how are they ever going to top that with something as beautiful? But they did. They managed.
Yeah. Now, I understand that there's a story behind the way that the footnotes are used in The Wolf's Curse, how that all evolved.
Sure. So when I first started writing The Wolf's Curse, I had decided that I was just going to play and have fun because, like I said, I had been writing for 13 years. This was my fifth or sixth book. None of them were selling. And I decided I was just going to let the story take me where it went. And so this wolf started talking, and all of a sudden footnotes started coming out, and she was making these little asides. And I just thought, well, I'm a debut author. Footnotes are never going to sell, but I'm just going to have fun with this because none of my other stories sold either. So I just went with it. And by the time I was done, the whole story was filled with footnotes. And my agent, right before, actually, I don't remember if it was my agent or my editor. It must have been my agent because it was right at the end of the process, right before we went on submission. She said, I think people might skip the footnotes. When you're reading on a Kindle, sometimes it can be easy if you have like a PDF on a Kindle. And we were finding with beta readers, people were just skipping the footnotes. So I moved a lot of those footnotes up into parentheticals in the story and just left a few sort of strategically placed footnotes that I thought just really helped showcase the voice of the wolf.
Have one or more of the modern or classic fantasy writers inspired the way you write in any way? Do you attribute someone's prior work to what you do, or is this basically a product of your inspiration?
I don't think that I could pick one specific author in terms of my inspiration. I will say that when I started writing my first couple of books, I was really bad at writing books. And I don't say that lightly. I actually had an agent tell me how bad I was at writing books. And so I decided, well, he's probably right. I haven't read middle grade for 20 plus years. I better figure out what this middle grade business is about. So I decided that I needed to figure out what type of books I wanted to write. And I decided I wanted to write literary books. So I went and I read every Newbery author and every honor winner for the last, I think it was 20 years or something like that. So that definitely shaped my idea of what a good book sounds like. There are many good books out there, but that just sort of cut away the research I had to do to find good books. So I attribute those authors to arriving at my own style. And then in terms of The Wolf's Curse, the book that actually inspired that story was The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I don't know if you've read that story, but it is set in Nazi Germany. And it's the story of a foster girl sent to live with a foster family, but it's narrated by death. And that was just so brilliant that I really wanted to try this business of writing a story for middle grade readers written by or narrated by death. So that's how I got here.
Now, when you create your characters, what's the basis for creating the character? Do you try to fit a character to a storyline? Do you look at a character as a separate entity and then think, okay, where can I put this character to take full advantage?
So I am not a plotter. I don't figure everything out in advance, but I do like to have a sort of skeleton to hang my writing on. So the things that I figure out in advance are I figure out the premise for my story. With the case of the wolf's curse, I already knew that it was going to be that there was this world where human babies were delivered by rabbits. And then I start looking for my characters. And I try to always at the beginning know what my character wants. So, what's the thing that my character believes is going to make them happy? Because that's the thing that's going to drive the plot. That's what they're going to be working for the whole story. But then I also try to identify what my character needs. So, what is the thing that my character doesn't know that they have to have in order to find true happiness? And so once I find those two things, then it's just a matter of playing around with voice until I find a character that comes fully alive in my head. Once that happens, I just write down what the character's telling me. Okay, how long do you have? I do not have a favorite author. It changes every single day. I'm currently obsessed with Dan Gemeinhart, whose new release just hit the New York Times bestseller list this week. So that's very exciting and very well deserved because his writing is just gorgeous. Erin Entrada Kelly is a beautiful author. Meg Medina. I mean, I could sit here all day long. I'm just constantly obsessed with new books and new authors.
For the future, what's in store for you as an author?
I am very glad you asked because I just announced a 2-book deal, again with Green Willow HarperCollins. So my next book will be called Coyote Queen, and it is the story of a girl who lives in Wyoming, and she joins a beauty pageant hoping to earn the prize money to escape her abusive stepfather. But then she discovers that she is turning into a coyote. And then the second book will come out a year later, and that's going to be a novel in verse.
How did you come up with that idea?
The Coyote Queen idea is really the story of my heart. So this is a story that I have been trying to write for now almost 20 years. The very first book that I ever wrote was a memoir because I had a very bizarre and unusual childhood. I moved almost 24 times before 4th grade, and there was poverty and all sorts of different things going on. So when I decided to write, I thought I'll just write a memoir because why make up anything when my own life was stranger than something I could make up? But I didn't have the writing chops. And I also realized that writing a memoir is really hard because life doesn't fit into a convenient narrative arc. And then there's also the fact that I have a really bad memory. So that wasn't going to work. But I tried just sort of iterations of this story again and again over the years. And it wasn't until right around the time that The Wolf's Curse sold that it occurred to me, because I realized that fantasy really was going to be my sweet spot, that maybe I should add a magical element to this story. And because coyotes were already in it, it just came to me that she should maybe have this metamorphosis throughout the story. So it was a long gradual process.
Now, if you weren't able to be a writer as a profession, what might you be doing?
I think I would probably be an editor. I don't think you could keep me away from books. And I do really love the process of helping people find the stories they want to tell and teaching them to tell it in the right way or in the way that is best suited for the story.
When I introduced you, I mentioned your website. Would you please let our readers know what wonderful things they can find there on your website and how they can access it?
Sure. The website is jessicavitalis.com. And of course, there's information about my books. I keep a list of some of my favorite middle grade stories. So if you're looking for new stories, you can check that out. And then one of my favorite parts of my website is I have a program called Magic in the Middle. And this is a free monthly set of book talks that you can sign up for, and I'll just deliver it email to your inbox every month, and I talk up my favorite fantasy books. So if you're looking for another story that you might like to read, or if you want to share that talk with your students to get them interested in new books, you can find that on my website as well.
I think that's a wonderful service that you're providing, because we teachers of language arts are constantly looking for ways to get kids involved in reading more and maybe spending a little less time on different apps that are more games or more social media than they are the actual reading. And we know that most of the authors will tell you that to be a good writer, you first have to be a good reader, that they are connected.
That is absolutely so true, and for me, it really is just born out of my love of books, and I read so many books that it didn't make sense for me not to share some of that with the world, and then before this recording started, you and I were talking about how important it is to lift each other up, so that's just one small way that I can take other authors and help hopefully introduce new readers to their work.
It's very generous. And as a teacher of language arts at the middle level and at the college level, I want to say thank you because you share the vision of most educators who are looking to enhance that reading process. I tell my students constantly that you will read, you will write everywhere. There is nothing you will ever do where reading and writing are not going to be relevant in some way or other. Doesn't matter what your job is, you're going to need to read, you're going to need to write.
That is so true. And just to illustrate that point, my husband is a professor of accounting, and a huge chunk of his job turned out to be writing because he has to write up his research reports. And so we tease each other back and forth a lot about who's the real writer in the family.
Jessica, thank you so much for taking an author's journey with us today. You are a dynamic individual and someone who is committed to the writing process, and I salute you for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Well, that concludes our journey for this day. Be sure to join me again for more conversation with more authors of interest. For an author's journey, I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Have a wonderful day.